Today I'm joined by 19-year-old Sean Lee. Sean is on the Youth Advisory Council, where he worked with Representative Jimmy Gomez in Los Angeles. He's been politically active since middle school, and he works with a lot of nonprofits, both around nonpartisan bridge building work, work around the Asian American community. And he's talking with us today about how people can get involved in their own communities and make a difference, and the importance of being an active participant in our communities. So I'm really excited about this conversation. I hope you are as well. Check out the video and let us know what you think. I'm going to let Sean introduce himself because he's got a million things that he's involved with. But we're really lucky to have him today. And we're going to be diving in on a bunch of different topics. So Sean, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for having me. It was an honor and my pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So Sean, you're with us today, mainly because you have taken the responsibility upon yourself to be a young leader in your community, and more specifically with being an Asian American leader, and representing a community. And I see that in two parts, which kind of come together, right? You're a young person leading youth, and you're an Asian American person leading an Asian American community. So can you talk about what that intersection looks like, and why you got involved in politics so young, and what that means to you?
Yes, thank you. So I think ever since the transition to my middle school to high school, like during that time, it was like a very pivot point in my life because I thought I really wanted to find something that I was passionate about and kind of finding the purpose and value to that. That's why, like, ever since even before middle school and during my elementary era, I was actually exploring what I wanted to do. And then I was actually a little lost because I didn't know like what to really do. I tried many different things out, from school to outside of school to around the States and all that. And then up to eighth grade, actually, I thought that, especially with the elections, with the campaigns, with the communities and peers around me and other communities around, I thought like just the word politics, or just to have a stance or get involved with that, was very important too. Because especially I think as an Asian American too, especially in my neighborhood here around Koreatown, I think a lot of people are aware of it, but it feels like we should be a little more involved to it, and we should have our voices more heard too, since having a stance for all of our communities is still important to the rest of the city, to the state, and to the whole country. So I think especially for me, like finding that kind of purpose and being passionate about what I wanted to do, I felt like politics was the kind of like the pathway to it, since it was really important to like everyone at the end.
And did you find that accessible, like to get into politics? Was it hard? Was it easy? What did that look like?
I mean, at first off, it was a little weird because there's definitely things that I wasn't used to. A lot of like outspoken people who are good with public speaking, debates, having different stances, because everything was in many different factors, and it was complicated because you had to have another person to saying this opinion, you would have another person just like screaming out the other opinion, like opposing it. And then there's just so much hostility as well, especially in politics, because obviously of the opinions and the political views we have. But I realized that taking both opinions and matters, not just like in a liberal or conservative or like Democrat, Republican, but really looking at it as a universal way of how we could actually find one way, or taking notes and taking those people's opinions and ideas so that it could be a equal, well balanced for both sides of the opposing sides.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, obviously we are Common Ally. We're all about common ground. We're about nonpartisan, relationships and communication to try to bridge this divide. So it's good to hear um, people going down that direction. I think it's vital as well. I don't think, obviously democracy dies when we're in our own corners, in our echo chambers. So we have to put in that work. Um, but I'm also concerned with, and rightfully so, I think there's a lot of young people who are disengaged. I think they feel forgotten, and to a large part they have been. They've been overlooked deliberately in a lot of communities. And they feel like their vote doesn't matter. I'm not saying that's everybody. There's also a lot of youth-led movements that are super inspiring. How do we motivate people who don't feel inspired, who don't feel counted, who don't feel represented? Um, And I think, I find you to be somewhat of an exception because of how interested, how passionate, how active you are. Um, how do we get people who aren't at that level to care and to vote and to be a part of this?
Well, I think that's a very good question too, because I think especially for the people who are already engaged in it and who are already so involved in it, like maybe if it's even something like a little small community event or a little small like ad or like a message of motivation, I feel like if we kind of go more in depth with those people and then kind of explain our perspective and then maybe even reach out to them saying like, is there any problems that you had recently or anything that's related with any kind of politics? And then maybe just kind of simply just reaching out and gradually just kind of listening to what they have to say and then just explain like why they weren't that engaged in politics, why didn't they vote last election? So things like that, I think kind of puts everything into consideration. And I think just like reaching out to them is like the first key we should do.
Yeah, great advice. Um, so what was your first point of inspiration? What made you get into this?
I mean, I
Like
think
what
it was especially like, yeah, in obviously going back to that middle school and high school transition,
yeah.
I think I realized that as I age and as I get into more of the real world and the understanding like the global perspective, we realize how like even the small things like we might not see right now, but that could eventually expand and express people's opinions in the later on future. Just like the current protests we are seeing and the current riots that we are seeing here. And I think just things like that because we might sometimes underestimate like a value beforehand, and then you see a couple of years later, you just see like an exponential growth on that, and then now we're trying to kind of struggling and don't know what to do. So it feels like maybe if we could kind of, I guess, plan a little bit ahead and kind of rethink and process those topics and values beforehand, I think that should be a much better case, especially with like the current times right now and what we're going through.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Obviously there's a lot of civil unrest. There's, the issue of, the fracture of race relations in this country is nothing new, obviously, but I think we're seeing it boil over in real time. Um, I'm in Santa Monica. I just saw downtown, in flames the other day, and you're in Koreatown, like you said, and obviously there's a lot of history there with what happened in the '90s. So, um, what does this mean for you? What does this mean for your community? How are you processing what's happening right now?
I mean, especially like in Koreatown too. I know that we haven't been getting those major threats or protests or hostility around here, but definitely, like kind of, empowering the community, like empowering the African Americans together. Because at the end of the day, like whether if you're this and that, we're like all in the same team together. And then I think the values sometimes, especially with racism, is something that I think both like African Americans, Asian Americans, just Caucasians, just anyone can be fighting for that. And especially in this current situation, it feels like maybe just instead of just causing violence or doing anything that is brutal, we can maybe do it in more of a peaceful way where it could be more understanding for people, and it can be a little more comprehensive so that we can all be in the same page. Of course, there's going to be frustrations, there's going to be anger, like we all understand that. But I think at the end of the day, doing that in the correct, authentic way, in my opinion, is going to help solve the issue. But of course, something like minor racism can still continue, but even just making small impacts so that our voices can be more heard clearly, I think that's a understandable way of approaching a big situation like this right now.
And have you faced similar racism? I know during the pandemic, a lot of Asian Americans um, were getting a lot of things thrown their way because of that. Did you see any of that during the pandemic? And what is your personal experience with racism?
Well, I mean, especially of course since the whole virus was from China and the president calling it kind of like with the Chinese virus and other, I guess, people agreeing to that or maybe just saying, oh, it's from this country, so we call it that virus. I mean, I think first of all, I guess that's just an unreasonable way of saying it because of course, like we get it. Like they're gonna be talking about the whole China Communist Party. We're gonna be talking about, oh, like it's from China, everything's from China, they have the biggest population. But I think we need a little bit more analysis than just, oh, it's from China. Oh, it just that's where it came from, the homeland country of the virus. I think we should be looking into perspective and how something like a global pandemic happened like this, that started from China. But just because of the reputation people have, I think it's kind of, I guess, heartbroken to Asian Americans like me or other people around it. And I think I did see some racism towards Asian Americans online, like many too, because just because an Asian American was at a grocery shopping at like more of a predominant white American place, they would just like view him as, oh, he's from China, and then they won't even know if he's Chinese or Japanese or Korean or any other kind of nationality. So I think definitely it's a different perspective of racism towards African Americans, but definitely I think I've seen it, I've witnessed it, but I didn't personally got discriminated just because of the
Yeah.
COVID-19 as myself. But I've seen a lot of videos for that.
And you mentioned the calling it the Chinese virus, and the Wuhan virus and everything else.
Mm.
Do do you think that this administration, and I know that both of us are really focused on staying nonpartisan and not trying to rile anything, right? So I want to be careful not to do that. Um, but over these last 4 years, do you feel like there has been a heightened level of racism and vitriol because of the way that race has been handled by this administration? Like I know it's not a one-off thing, the way that the virus was handled. Um, do you see that more, or is that not a thing?
Well, I mean, I guess in my point of view, I guess it is still a half and half. Like, of course, I understand the administration's perspective as well, and of course, how race is dealt with all levels of government. But I just think, like at top hand, when people are just whether on social media or if they're talking to people, they will usually try to mention the federal government and like the president first, based on how he's been handling, such as like racism. But he still says it's not racist. But I think, of course, like people, like whether if it's me or you or other people, can have different perspectives on that based on like the word choice or like the language that the government uses. But I think definitely like we've still seen division because especially with this president, just I guess the campaign or just the revolution that he was trying to build, I think it was a little offensive to other people compared to like other presidential candidates who had a model like keep stronger or let's do it together. But he had it more like, oh, let's have these people, or kind of like making America great again, thinking like, oh, let's make certain people of race
Yeah.
greater again. And then kind of leaning towards a false dilemma towards other race.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I live in a multiracial family, and that "Make America Great" thing does bring out the fact that some people are just deemed other. They're not a part of that vision. Um, and my concern is that I'm all about always making us great, right? Like you should always be progressing and changing and evolving and being better and better. So sure, great message, right? But I think the way that message has rolled out, it doesn't really include everyone. So that's why I wanted to kind of ask that and see how you were experiencing that. um
Mm.
you had mentioned media as well, and I certainly want to get into sensationalized media. um what is your take on that? And I want to hear what you say about that, obviously, but I also want to hear about, like, what are your sources? Like, where do you go to get news?
Mhm. Well, so I mean, especially like for me, like, so our school, we actually had the IB program, which is, especially in our English class, we really focus it on the political and mass communication on our first unit. And I think especially like when we find our sources, like finding it from a credible person, like an academic person who writes it, I think will be the most trustworthy one, because obviously media, whether if they're a CNN, whether if they're from Fox, MSNBC, like they're doing it, I think, for their own benefit, because obviously it's a media platform, everyone knows it, and then they're trying to gain profit. So I guess this whole sensationalism, fake news tactics are pretty much used in every source of media. I think despite just CNN, but whether that's from Fox, from other media platforms, they all have a personal agenda, which makes people say, oh, it's fake news just because they oppose the president, or it's fake
Mm.
news because Nancy Pelosi said that, oh, from Fox News, like that. So I think just the tactics that each media uses is based on their political ideologies. And then I think that's the main complaint and that's the main issue that we are approaching. But definitely, I think before even looking at the media, like reading from historians' perspectives, from books, like
Yeah.
academic affiliated people, I think that's the number one way we should do it before we go out there in public and start ranting about, oh, how great Fox News is or how great CNN is, things like that.
Yeah. It's not easy to source those things, especially for people who lead busy lives and don't really fully understand how the government even works. So I think I'm with you 100%, especially for profit, publicly traded media conglomerates probably shouldn't be your first step, but it is for a lot of people. Um, so what, is there something at least, as maybe a quick tip for people? Is it listening to The Wire? Is it the AP? Is it, public radio? Is it like what can at least people start with outside of, straight from the source reporting?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think like maybe I mean, of course, like if you want to look at the media articles first, then you could do it. But I just think while you're doing that, just I think just being careful of what you say, and then when you read stuff, obviously it will have bias. Like there's bias everywhere, and I think just first, if you have something against that media or if you agree it, I think my suggestion is not say it because obviously there's going to be people who strongly goes against you and there's going to be people who agree with you. So I think maybe first keeping it to yourself first and then doing your research and watching even just like couple academic videos, in my opinion, like getting your facts straight, getting your
Yeah.
analysis. I think there should be a little more preparation before you start speaking out and then accidentally saying something wrong. And then now it's going to lead to this whole media platform
Yeah.
hostility and partisanship.
Yep. And I assume you were taught civics, just from your interest level, but was that a thing in your school?
I mean, yeah, we had a little bit, but I think it was mainly like other extracurricular and other nonprofits I was trying to get involved in, and that
Yeah.
kind of expanded the way through from academics.
And just overall, do your peers have a good understanding of civics?
Yeah, I mean, at least from my community and my school, I think we have a pretty good understanding of it, but despite the disagreements, but I think especially for where I graduated from a Christian private high school there. So I think especially, of course, we'll have like other perspectives in religion, but I think at the end, we know the civics and we know how to approach people in a friendly manner. But of course, when people are just obviously easily angered by it, then we might automatically like kind of have a different mindset to it. But I think at the end, everyone should know their limitations. And I think my community does that as well.
Yep. Great. Um, I want to talk about some issues here. So I know you're passionate about healthcare and gun control. Um, and obviously fill me in on any of the other ones that are really like important and vital to you, but those alone we could probably have a 10-hour conversation. um Gun control to me is always a tricky one. I think we hit a lot of walls when we try to go through how to talk about gun violence with people who are very focused on the Second Amendment. And I'm interested to see from your perspective, where do we find the common ground there? um, how are you reaching out to people on the other side of the issue? And can you talk a little bit about why that's an important issue for you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that's a very heated topic as well here in America, and especially for gun control. I mean, I think because just looking at our history in the past, I think the US has one of the most gun events or gun violence compared to other countries, if you look at other documentaries. But I think, of course, first of all, I respect the Second Amendment, and that's from the Constitution, from our founding fathers all the way up
Yep.
to our history. But I just think people right now are fighting is that innocent people are just getting harmed, and people who have the weapon might just be doing it because he's going through a mental health issue or he has some other kind of problem or didn't know his limitation beforehand. And I think that's mainly, I guess, the Democrats in Congress's argument, right? But of course,
Yeah.
on the other hand, when we have people like Mitch McConnell and other Republican senators, they're just, I guess, very big on the whole constitutional right and the amendment, saying that, oh, like as an American, we have that kind of freedom and it's like a God-given right. And of course, like I understand that since it's going into a historical perspective. But of course, what the other parties are fighting against is, of course, there's a constitutional law in that, but they're saying to what extent. And I think the main issue from there is how they're bringing up so many evidence behind the past, saying how majority of the people, and if you look at the statistics, they're kind of saying that, oh, these violence happened because we allowed them to have one, or it's because in some states like Texas or Oklahoma, they allow those things to have or make them sell. So I guess that's the main argument that
Mhm.
Democrats are fighting for. But I mean, I still understand both perspectives on why, like how it's a right and how, on the other hand, it might get out of control. And I think we just need to find an equal balance of saying, oh well, maybe we could sell guns in certain places, but you must have like a ID, because like some other states you could just straight up just buy it without showing any kind of ID proof or anything. So just really kind of analyzing the past and what happened. I think that's the way we should be handling gun control.
Yeah, so you're talking about starting with dialogue, conversation, and then sensible gun laws that are agreeable for both parties and both people.
Hmm.
I mean, on both sides of the issue. That's great. Um, and as a younger person who grew up in a, a different kind of gun culture than I did, um, what is that like? Do you feel threatened going to school? Is that a more do you have a heightened sense of awareness to that? Like, I think you could speak differently than most people because you've been a part of that culture. What is that like?
Yeah, I mean, especially in my neighborhood and in my community here, we definitely now I think expanded the emergency practices just in case something unprecedented happened. And of course, we're fully aware of it. And since like where I come from is mainly liberal and left leaning, obviously there will be a lot more complaints and oppositions of guns. And I think the way I learned it and viewed it was how there are people mostly just going against anti-gun people
Mm,
because of just the ideology we have. But I do understand the other perspectives as well, who are not liberals in this community. But we just need to be practicing and being aware and just hoping the best that, of course, nothing like nothing like those unfortunate events can happen. But I think we just fully rely on our government and law enforcement and how they could have those things under control before something or like a major outbreak happens before that.
yeah, yeah, and I think there's also there's a responsibility to humanize that issue as well, to see that there's people behind this. Yes, there's, we need to think about the Constitution, we need to think about safety, we need to think about all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, people are dying, and we have to come up with a
Mm,
solution. Um,
right.
so hopefully, we could see some good groundwork there. Um, Talk to me about cause. What is cause?
Oh yeah, so CAUSE was actually a nonprofit political organization. It actually stands for Center for Asian American Self-Empowerment. And it was actually I was involved around during sophomore year with like it was like a gala. It was with other members in Congress, and pretty much the motto and then the goal for this nonprofit was people to be engaged, especially Asian Americans, to spread the word of voting and to just make sure that each value that they hear, they want to input our voices so that Asian Americans can also have this kind of empowerment and revolution that we could bring up to the table. And that was the main thing for this organization. And I pretty much supported the other staff members there and then the board members there as well.
Wow, that's great. Um,
Mhm.
and then what about the Toastmasters International? And then I know you already spoke about the Youth Advisory Council, but can you go into what that was like to work with Jimmy Gomez and what his campaign looked like and what that taught you?
Yeah, so yeah, I'll start with the Toastmasters first and then
Yeah.
go into the Youth Advisory Council.
Hmm.
So yeah, the Toastmasters is basically and this was not even politically related. It was just based on public speaking, and it was just a club based on that. And it was a franchise club where it was available around the whole US and the world. So it's pretty much that if you had a hard time speaking, or if you wanted to just improve your public speaking skills, or if you just wanted to maybe discuss certain topics or certain stances with the club members, that's what Toastmasters was about. It was about building a community, building your public speaking skills, and making sure that your leadership and your opinions and your ideals were all universally heard. And that's what I've been practicing and what other members in that club have been practicing. So mainly it was, of course, it was a lot of political topics, but just like even for fun, like if you had a hard time speaking or communicating, it was just for that skill to be improved, and that was their main goal for that club. And for the Youth Advisory Council, which was another big one, I mean, obviously this was like congressional team. And I think, I mean, Congressman Jimmy Gomez, he's a great man. I mean, great man of faith. And I think he really cares about the community because he represents one of the main like big districts, which includes downtown, Koreatown, I think Boyle Heights, Highland Park, Eagle Rock, those districts. And especially like for him caring and fighting for what all Angelinos are fighting for. And then I think that was something important because especially when he goes back in the Capitol and then making sure that all of our ideals were collected. And when he goes there, I think the way he is kind of like approaching the other people in Congress and the other Republicans, I think that was something that all of our youth advisory council members were proud of. But of course, like with the whole COVID-19 outbreak, we were planning to, go on like even a lunch with them or do like major events, whether if that was like a cleanup or whether if there was just like another congressional event. And that was all planned, but of course, the pandemic just made it all happen virtually. So that
And
kind of
what
all
it,
got canceled.
yeah, and what's that like? Like the virtual world with, campaigns now is completely changed. Is that something that you were able to easily adapt to? Um, I think for grassroots organizing, obviously being face to face is essential, but when you take that element out, what does that look like?
I mean, definitely like moving on to this whole virtual online thing, it's been a very different and difficult transition to everyone, not just like people in government, but even just students in their education and just other Angelinos and everyone around the country just working remotely. But definitely, I think people are still willing to work and still willing to, do what they're meant to do. And especially like for me, like still being in those virtual events stuff with other clubs and organizations. I think that's what I was proud of, and other people who actually joined those calls and who are still involved virtually. I think we were just pretty much respected and proud of each other since we were still trying to continue that because we saw the November election coming up. But just because of the pandemic, I don't think an election will be prevented. So just like a lot of minor things that we can do as of now until quarantine is lifted.
Yeah,
That's what our main goal was.
good. Talk about that. Talk about the election coming up in November. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I mean, I honestly think, I mean, it feels like it might be a very close election. Like it's still very hard to predict right now because I think it really depends on like swing states like Michigan, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Because I think
Mhm.
obviously we're already set with which states are going to go red, which states are already going to go blue. Like California, probably most likely Joe Biden will be getting it, I think. And other just red states, we obviously know that Trump will be getting. So I think it really depends on the swing states and how hard those candidates really campaign and get those voters in those middle states. Because I think once they have those middle states, it's kind of like a game changer, just like what happened back in 2016 with
Yeah.
Clinton.
Is it, but there's also some really interesting like light blue states, like things that you
Hmm.
like when you're hearing Utah and Texas and Arizona and Georgia and all these places where it's like they weren't really in play before. It's interesting to see what's what. And yeah, I mean I'm certainly not in the business of predictions and I have no idea what's gonna happen. I'm more interested and fascinated by um, the issue of voter suppression, outside influence, um, and then really just how the pandemic has affected voter, mail-in voting, the issue of that, what voting's going to look like, and just the unrest that we're going through right now. It makes it feel very unsettling. Whereas before it was polarized politics, and now there's a lot of other issues that are playing. Um, and I'm curious to see how that all plays out. I'm slightly worried, but that's kind of where I wanted to see what you were feeling.
I mean, of course, when it comes to November, we'll know, but I definitely think that even like small things that each candidate does, whether if that's Biden or Trump, and just doing something or maybe just approaching a different strategy. Because like I think if you look at like let's say Texas for example, I mean obviously overall it's a Republican red state, but you can still see like minor counties despite the major cities, but just like little minor counties like in the countryside, you could already like see it like back from 2018 when it was Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. Even
Mhm.
just with like the Senate election, we can see how federal work kind of switched some red to blue um, counties. And I just think those minor developments that like a candidate like Beto does is probably something, I guess, I guess it could be a little alarming, or it could also be positive and negative based on how you view it. But I definitely think just like those little minor counties can
Yeah.
really have a big effect on one presidential candidate, because like one vote off or by 10 votes off, it could still make a huge difference, and it could pretty much flip the whole state just because of those little counties.
Yeah. And how do we get people to look past the presidential election? Like, how do we get people interested down ticket voting and getting involved local and state politics? Like, how do we do that?
Yeah, I think especially if you want to first like really get into it, I think it's first in the local level, whether that's from neighborhood council, city council member, volunteer event, or maybe even supporting the mayor's office. Like that's like I kind of how I started off with, just like with city council members and minor neighborhood councils like that. Because I think first we just want to first look at it locally, like what's affecting us around our neighborhood and city first. And then once that is kind of lifted, then we could kind of expand ourselves into like the state level with state assembly members, state senators, with the governors. And then after that, another step can be like a more country federal wide, and kind of now look at perspectives from the federal government, from the White House to Congress to the Supreme Court, and pretty much relate all those issues and kind of, I guess, come into one idea and then kind of look towards that path.
Give me your top three issues that you think all campaigns should be focusing on. Take politics out of it. Just what issues affect everybody's lives, especially young people.
I mean, especially I think in our generation, in our society, is definitely healthcare. Immigration is another hot topic that Congress has been so partisan about. And I think a third issue can be especially just the theme of justice or just the discrimination behind it. Or I think either that or just our economy as a whole, just like how our finance
Yeah.
work and how we don't want to go through another major crisis like COVID-19, and how we don't want to make the same mistakes in the past.
And all three of those are tied together, whether we like it or
Right.
not.
Hmm.
On healthcare, where do you stand? Is it universal for all? Is it, single payer? What It's a confusing topic for a lot of people who don't get into the weeds on it.
Hmm.
For all non-political wonks, um, how would you wrap up a healthcare system that makes sense to you?
Well, I mean, I mean, of course, there's different perspectives to it, but I think especially when it comes to healthcare, whether if it's the most vulnerable people or whether if it's for the people who doesn't know how to get access to it, I think maybe in this case, a universal healthcare can be beneficial, because especially like healthcare that we look at here, just in the state of California, there's different healthcares that we are taking cover into, and there are so many healthcare insurances, and people get confused at this point because based on if you want to go to this doctor, you have to go to this clinic, this department, and you have to use this insurance, and some other insurance for this medical hospital might not be valid because it's only accepted here. So I just think like that whole complicated process is what makes people so frustrated, because
Yeah.
if you're really ill and if you need like an emergency surgery, people would probably not want to be going through that, especially if they're the one going through it and then other hospitals not accepting them because they don't have the proper insurance. So I feel
Yeah.
like in that case, if we just had one health insurance that kind of covered everything, but of course in the United States that's kind of hard because of how big our country is. But I think maybe if state governments can just focus on those kind of aspects just for the state people, maybe that might be a different or better approach than just the federal government just telling people what to do and be like, well, this is insurance for Medicaid, Medicare, we have Blue Shield, other cases like that. So I think if state governments can kind of provide their own state insurance, I think that might be helpful for a lot of vulnerable
Mm.
people.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think, again, economics plays a role in that too. I think the more uninsured people we have, the more that weighs in the system, and we pay for that anyways. So I think that if you can't find the compassion part of the story, there is an economic fallout as well, and I think people need to see both sides of that, no matter where you stand on it. But um, so what's next? What does Sean do next? What does the future look like for you? What are you up to right now? Um, Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, especially in quarantine, I'll probably have to continue those virtual stuff. But as soon as the fall hits or as soon as everything is a little bit gradually lifted, I mean, obviously, because I have to go to school because I'm going to school in DC, in George Washington. So
Oh,
that's
nice,
where I'll
man.
be studying. Yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you. And that's where I'll be studying the whole political science and the government structure of that, since that's what I want to kind of study and then kind of make other people's impact as well, whether that's from an organization or whether that's just from a elected office or just anything that could be helping other people. I think that's what my main goal was. And
Hmm.
I'm just hoping whether if that's from DC or coming back to LA or moving somewhere else, anything that I guess could make an impact or helping other people, I think that's the main key that I'm trying to address.
Great, man. I think you're going to do really well. You're already doing it. You did it early on, and I think you're coming from the right place. So, great to see that. I'd love to hear, in closing here, just a couple pieces of advice for people, um, in a couple different ways. So, first of all, I know you know what we do at Common Ally. Creating a platform that educates and activates young people and rewards them in the process. For reaching across the aisle to try to get things done and taking ourselves out of like kind of clickbait culture to actually activate ourselves. So in that vein, how do we create more common allies? How do we bring people together? And what's a couple pieces of advice for your peers that you would give?
I mean, definitely, if there's something that you really want to do or make an impact on, or if you know deep down in your heart, instead of just taking a shortcut, and if you kind of really found that kind of goal, but of course that goal can change, and of course it's not like I'm asking, oh, you should do this part or this part, but genuinely trying to find what you're passionate about and what your goal is. I think that's the best way to strive it. Of course it's going to be a process and it might be very difficult for other people, but I think just the effort we put into it, I think that's the most important part, because obviously like I'm not perfect, no one else is perfect, and even if we wanted to be perfect, of course the solution to that might not end as well, but of course just giving your best effort into it and then really just trying to kind of also value yourself and then making sure that other opinions are respected as well, especially in our society,
Yeah.
is very important too. And just kind of, yeah, finding that kind of pathway that you want and how that will take you in the future.
Great, man. And to
Mm.
the background of sirens, it was
Right.
perfect.
Especially, I think there's still riots and protests probably, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's been crazy.
All right. Well, stay safe, man, and keep doing what you're doing. I think you're on a great path, and it's inspiring to hear your story. And I think other people who hear it are going to be inspired as well. So let's stay in touch. I'm really interested to see what you do in the future.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me, Aaron.
You got it.